Terrific. Well, no, thank you everyone for joining us. We're all here to learn from Hakan about the Turkish economy and the way this will be organized. That Hakan will speak for about 15 to 20 minutes, or as long as it takes, present to us how Turkey has partly gone towards price stability, but not quite fully all the way there, and to learn about that path and what's ahead and what's behind. And then after 15, 20 minutes, we'll have a brief chat. I'll ask a few questions, very brief, and then I'll open to the floor so that everyone can also ask questions. If you have questions, just type them up in the chat, and I'll call on you to unmute yourself and then to ask your question yourself when the time comes. But for now, thank you so much, Hakan Kara, for joining us here. It's a pleasure to have you at the LSE, kind of virtually, and I look forward to hearing you.
Thank you, Ricardo. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invitation to LSE Students Union Developing Markets group. I work at the central bank for almost 20 years in the past 2 decades. And today's presentation, it will mostly reflect my own experiences at the bank, plus some of the research that we conducted jointly with the colleagues from the central bank. I will now share my presentation, if I can. Can you see the screen?
Yes, everything looking great.
Good. Yeah, okay. So let me just do the full screen. The presentation about Turkey's story on inflation, and some of them will reflect my personal experiences and judgments rather than scientific research, but I will also try to complement my arguments with some of the research that we conducted with my colleagues recently with the central bank. So let me start with, for those of you who are not familiar with the Turkish inflation, let me start with this chart showing the CPI inflation in Turkey for the last 100 years. So it's the inflation since the beginning of the modern Turkish Republic. And as you can see, we didn't have much problem with inflation until 1970. So on average, actually, Turkey managed to keep inflation around, on average, 6-7%. But after 1970s, there was a couple of shocks, starting from the oil price shock, and then political instabilities and the lack of adequate institutions and populist policies have led to a rise in inflation to almost 120% by mid-2090s. So inflation came down to triple digits, actually. And afterwards, we had a couple of attempts with IMF programs and so on, which managed to bring inflation to some levels. But still, you can see that Turkey has struggled with high inflation for almost 30 years. Inflation was around 60-70%. And indeed, Bob Shiller actually has identified Turkish case as unique in the sense that we were the only country that lived with high inflation, very high inflation for almost 30-40 years, but didn't go into hyperinflation. So that's an interesting case. And after 2001, we had the most devastating crisis of our history. That was the deepest financial crisis. And the Turkish economy collapsed, and came a couple of reforms. So the banking sector was completely restructured, fiscal consolidation, and then the inflation came down. But the most important, I think, development was the independence of the central bank. So in 2001, with the new central bank, the central bank was granted instrument independence, and the law also stated that the ultimate objective of the central bank should be price stability. So that was the first time it was stated explicitly. And that helped to actually bring inflation down, coupled with the other reforms. But this period between 2001 and 2005 is very interesting in the sense that we had this sharp disinflation period without much output cost. So there was, the growth rate was very robust at that period, but the inflation came down from like 70% to 7%. Let me just focus on that period so that That chart shows like the 4 years of successful disinflation. At the beginning of 2002, the inflation expectations, which is the blue line, was around 50%, whereas the inflation target was 35%. So there was the implicit inflation targets embedded in the IMF program. And in a couple of years, the inflation came down to 8%, and the expectations have converged to 8% almost. So that was a really very successful disinflation period. And I think the more interestingly, we had average growth rate at 6% at that period. So that shows the power of managing expectations with a deep structural program. So we were encouraged by the success. And I was at the bank at that time. I was the head of the modeling division. We were encouraged with the success and decided to adopt the full-fledged inflation targeting in 2006. So we went with the full-fledged inflation targeting in 2006, and that lasted a couple of years. After the global financial crisis, we did some soul searching because the capital flow volatility was increasing. The quantitative easing by advanced economies have created significant challenges in managing the external accounts and the exchange rates. And we decided to go to a more flexible version of inflation targeting, and we called it a hybrid model, which is the IMF is now working on this integrated model. Rita Govinat and her friends are actually developing some framework to implement a broader version of inflation targeting. But we did that in 2010, actually. And so the idea was to just incorporate the financial stability into the inflation targeting framework. So we adopted multiple instruments. We started using foreign currency, foreign exchange reserves actively. The reserve requirements and the liquidity policies were used. And the central bank explicitly started paying a lot of attention on the exchange rate volatility, the composition of capital inflows, and the credit growth, and so on. We never imposed capital controls, but we have heavily engaged with the macroprudential policies in order to manage the composition of capital flows and so on. In this period, the average inflation was 10% or more. So in terms of the disinflation process, it was not successful at all. And given the discontent with the inflation, actually, recently the government has appointed a new central bank governor. And the central bank in the last couple of months have reverted back to the previous conventional inflation targeting that we adopted in 2006. So in the rest of my presentation, I will talk about, I will try to analyze actually what happened with the inflation dynamics and the behavior of inflation expectations. And also that research has been also partly inspired by Ricardo's research, previous research on inflation expectations and looking at the inflation surveys and so on. So let me first put this graph, which shows the target and inflation in Turkey. And obviously, the striking picture from this graph is that the orange bars are always above the blue bars. So the inflation was always above the targets. And especially look at the last couple of years where the inflation tripled and even doubled the targets. And obviously this has started changing the expectations behavior. So this chart is just a high frequency version of inflation, which is the orange line, which is the monthly inflation, but the annual, it's the annual inflation in monthly frequency. So there's a lot of volatility here. The blue line is the medium-term inflation expectations taken from a professional forecaster survey. And the gray line is the two-year ahead inflation, two-year ahead targets, official targets by the central bank, which was 5% in recent years. And you can see that the blue line was close to the gray line until 2013. So the inflation expectations were slightly above the target, but they were anchored in the sense that we didn't see much movements. They were anchored at a higher level than the target, but still people expected like 6% inflation in 2 years, which was reasonable actually. But look what happened after 2013. This blue line started getting apart from this gray line and getting closer to the orange line. So the higher and higher inflation actually has made those expectations divert from the targets and get closer to the actual inflation. So that's obviously the first moment. But let me also show the second moment here, which is the disagreement of inflation expectations. So the blue line shows a survey which is like 2,000 firms, which are mostly industrial firms. And the orange line shows the disagreement across the professionals, almost like hundreds of professionals filling out the survey of central bank. And you can see that the dispersion has increased hugely in 2018 with the rise in inflation uncertainty and so on. It came back partly, but still the standard deviation is like 6, which is very, very high. And it looks like the inflation expectations are far from anchored in the sense that. And we conducted a recent study where we tried to understand the drivers of the private inflation forecast. And what we did was we threw a bunch of questions to the survey respondents. And actually, we just gave them a list of variables, and we wanted them to rank according to their importance in their inflation forecast. So that's direct surveying the surveyors, actually. And the inflation target was ranked the least important variable. So people just stopped looking at inflation targets. So this was a survey that we conducted in end 2018, actually, where inflation expectations were disanchored. But look at this yellow line. It is the central bank forecast, the official forecast, because we were curious about, okay, the inflation targets are not serving as an anchor anymore, but what about the inflation forecast of the central bank? It is also ranked at the bottom. You can see that the importance of the central bank forecast has also disappeared. And which variables are the main drivers of inflation? That's on the left-hand side. So you see the top 2 variables as the exchange rate and the past inflation. So people, when they were forming their inflation expectations, actually, they cited the past inflation and the exchange rate as the most important variables. So this is this is a very undesirable situation for a central bank because people stop looking at forecasts and your targets. So what we did in the paper is upcoming in the International Journal of Central Banking soon. What we did was basically using this feedback, actually, we constructed an empirical model based on the individual data on the surveys, and we look at the sensitivity, how the sensitivity of the inflation expectations have changed through time, and look at the past inflation, exchange rate depreciation, and some other variables, and they all show that the sensitivity of the past of the inflation expectations to past inflation and the exchange rate depreciation has become significant in recent years, again confirming the weakening and the degree of anchoring inflation expectations. And not surprisingly, this term which we call inertia has started increasing through time. What we call, it is debatable whether this should be called inertia, but I call it inertia. Let me explain what it is. It is the constant term, the drift term, in a time-varying parameter estimated Phillips curve. So what we did was we just estimated a augmented Phillips curve, a Turkish version of that. So we had a bunch of variables, but it looks like a Phillips curve. And we look at the time-varying coefficients of what happened, what's going on with the drift term, with the constant term through time. And that's the red line. So the striking feature is that this term has been drifting up and up through time. And now, especially after 2018, it jumps. And you can see that the constant term has reached to 6 percentage points. So what does that mean? Economically, I would interpret this as follows. Even if the variables, the macro variables, they stay intact, like exchange rate or the oil prices or the output gap doesn't change, the central bank starts the year with a 6 percentage points inflation in the pocket. So that's that's a really challenging situation for the central bank, because it will have to exert more effort to convince the economic agents to change their pricing behavior expectations and so on. So in the final part of my presentation, I asked this question: what is special with Turkey? Because if you look at the other emerging market economies, all of them solve the inflation problem, except Argentina, which is another case. But Turkey has diverged. If you look at the inflation in Turkey and emerging market economies, the difference between Turkey and the other emerging economies has been getting wider and wider through time. And what is the problem with Turkey? And we discussed this issue domestically, actually. And then some economists propose that Turkey has its own structural real problems, and it will be very difficult to disinflate through monetary policy. So there's a big discussion, hot debate in Turkey. And some people cite, for example, inefficiencies in the agricultural sector, or the composition of the tax structure is tilted too much towards indirect taxes, or inefficient product markets, and the lack of competition in the markets, and so on. So there are, you can just make this list longer and longer. But my explanation, my question is that how could other countries do it? Look at Peru, or look at the South Africa or Philippines. They don't have less structural problems than Turkey, right? So my own explanation is that I have a couple of explanations, but they are more derived from my judgment at the central bank, working at the central bank for many years, dealing with the policy issues. That the first question is, was inflation ever a priority for the Turkish case? Because the first thing is, if you look at the successful disinflation period in any country, the main prerequisite is the willingness and the desire to bring inflation down. But in the Turkish case, because of the frequent elections, geopolitical risks, and we had lots of different shocks, like we had a coup attempt in 2015, a Syrian war, 6 million Syrian refugees came to Turkey, and so on. So the government has never prioritized actually inflation. I think that's one of the reasons. And that attitude has also diffused into the central bank, because the central bank started losing independence through time. The second reason is more technical, in the sense that Turkey has accumulated a sizable amount of external liabilities in the past 10 years, especially after the global financial crisis, with the liquidity pumped by the advanced economies into the system. We had massive capital inflows, mostly in the form of short-term inflows, and coupled with the large current account deficit, this has made the Turkish economy more fragile to the global developments. And Turkish domestic financial conditions started becoming more sensitive to the changes in the global risk sentiment and the changes in the global financial conditions, and that worsened the policy trade-offs. So let me explain what I mean. This is a graph that shows the external financing needs of emerging economies. So on the left-hand side, what you see is the total external financing needs across emerging market economies, and Turkey and the peers, actually. You can see that the Turkey again tops the list. So we have the largest amount of short-term liabilities compared to our central bank reserves. And that makes Turkey much more fragile, a high beta country, against the fluctuations in the US 10-year interest rates and the changes in the dollar index and so on affects Turkey considerably. And on the right-hand side, I show the real effective exchange rate appreciation across emerging market economies. So a negative figure here is a depreciation, a real depreciation of currency. Again, Turkey makes the top of the list. On the right-hand side, you can see that the Turkish lira has depreciated sharply, especially after 2013, which was triggered by the Fed tapering in 2013. And all these issues have worsened the policy trade-offs, especially after the taper tantrum, when the capital inflows have weakened and Turkish lira started depreciating. The pressures on central banks started, because the trade-offs have increased, because when the exchange rate depreciates, that starts affecting inflation because of the lack of policy anchor, the exchange rate passes through the inflation very quickly. But then the problem is that at the same time, the capital outflows lead to a tightening in financial conditions. So you have a tighter financial conditions, but the rising inflation when the central bank is, has a big trade-off in such a case. And that has actually increased the pressures on the central bank. And the central bank was sometimes cutting monetary policy earlier than expected, or sometimes the central bank was reluctant to tighten monetary policy because of political influence. And even the government started creating, bypassing monetary policy in these times, because when the economy slowed down, what the government did is they created injecting credit into the system through public banks by using the credit guarantee fund, treasury-backed credit guarantee fund, and so on. So it weakened the monetary policy transmission further because the government was impatient about a slowdown in the economy. And whenever the central bank tightened monetary policy, they undid the monetary easing by the credit stimulus through public banks. So this process actually has worsened the policy trade-off, and the central bank credibility has eroded through time. And the central bank was not allowed to respond very, very strongly to these developments, and that has created an inflation and exchange rate spiral. So the central bank was sometimes behind the curve because of the indirect influence of the government, and we had this spiral because whenever the exchange rate depreciated, that passed through domestic inflation, but higher inflation fed into inflation expectations. And in the absence of an appropriate policy response, this has turned into a spiral. And the vicious circle continued until recent years, especially in the last couple of years. This is the story. And the good news is that a new central bank governor is appointed, and recently the central bank started tightening monetary policy and changed the rhetoric. So they have adopted a simpler monetary policy, and also a more focused approach on price stability. They have changed the communication policy in a more hawkish tone. So that's a change for good, actually. But the question is whether this approach will be successful alone or not, because the problem is the central bank changed the policy, but the rest of the macro policies are there, and I'm not sure whether the objective function of the top authorities have changed. So that means just relying on the central bank for the disinflation process will be very costly, and I'm not sure whether the politicians will be patient enough to bear this process. So it's a complicated task at this point, but at least, the change in the behavior of the central bank is a step in the right direction. So let's hope that they succeed. Let me conclude. Thank you for the patience.
Great, thank you so much, Hakan. That was really terrific, extremely sharp and synthetic, as I expected. And so I hope we'll have a great discussion afterwards. So starting now, those people who want to ask questions, please start just putting them in the chat. I'm going to start talking to Hakan, but then I'll stop to raise questions that come from you guys. Hakan, I was very struck by the fall in the real exchange rate and how large it's been, the accumulated real exchange rate over the last 7 years. What is the real factor driving that? Because depending on what those real factors are, maybe it was optimal to have high inflation insofar as if you think that there's some nominal rigidities in the economy, it may actually have been better to have some high inflation in response to a very, very large real shock. So what were the factors behind the real exchange rate appreciation that was just so striking and so persistent, it seems?
I think there are a couple of factors. The first one I would rank the current account deficit. We had, by 2013, actually, we had almost 8% deficit, 8% of GDP, and which was financed by short-term inflows, and that was not sustainable. Actually, at some point, the investors thought that was sustainable because Turkey was approaching towards negotiations with the European Union. Turkey was upgraded by rating agencies. Everything was going in the right direction. There was productivity increase. So, I mean, people who invested Turkey, they believed that that was sustainable. And after 2013, the domestic political setting has changed, actually. And also people realized that the current account deficit was not sustainable because the productivity level started shifting down, and the perception towards Turkey has changed, especially after the coup attempt in 2016, and that the story about Turkey has changed. And the foreigners, they were no longer willing to finance this deficit. I think the main driver is the changing story. But also
when I look at the real exchange rate falling, Hasan, would you say that it's because we had inflation leading to a depreciation of the nominal exchange rate that was driving the real exchange rate to a large extent, and so that was a contribution? Or was it that there was also shocks lowering the real exchange rate? From what I understood, you told me a bit of both, but it's not. But it is the case that some of this fall was just price rigidities and the big nominal exchange rate depreciation. In that sense, if we had stabilized inflation, we may have had a smaller fall in that. Would you say that's part of the story or not? I'm just trying to get here the causality of partly we're responding to the real shocks. Or
yeah, that was partly. I think it was also partly related to the fact that I think the government officials thought that a competitive devaluation would fix the current account deficit, actually. But they neglected one point. As the market have understood this motive, actually, the inflation expectations started shifting up and the pass-through has increased. And when the pass-through has increased, the amount of the nominal depreciation that is needed for the real adjustment has increased more and more and more. And it turned into a spiral. Actually. Right. That's my story.
Very good. Let me just call on one question and then I'll follow more. Musa H, if you're going to mute yourself on Turkey's economic growth.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for your talk. My question is, I don't know much about Turkish economy, so it'd be interesting to hear what you have to say. One thing which I don't understand is Turkey's economic growth. It's 1 year, I think they have minus 5%, and the next year it goes to 8%. Then it's minus 0.5, then it's 9. What is driving such volatile economic growth?
That's a good question, actually. That was a question also asked by the rating agencies repeatedly to me. And I don't have a good explanation for that. It's just the fact that we have many shocks. I mean, we live in a very risky region, and that shock creates a lot of volatility. But Turkey also is very resilient, and the Turkish people are used to living with uncertainty. And when the government provides the right incentives, actually, the Turkish economy starts to recover very quickly. I mean, the last year, for example, Turkey was one of the two countries that posted positive growth along with China. So during the pandemic year, actually, we had positive growth. And the reason was that the government has used public banks to extend massive amount of credit with a very low interest rate. And given the negative real interest rate, people rushed to the banks and they just took those credit and they spent. So that created vulnerabilities, definitely. And because of those vulnerabilities, now our economy is more fragile. So it's very sensitive to the changes in the global financial conditions. And that's part of the volatility.
Hasan, one of the things I noticed in your surveys was this dependence. Well, you pointed as well that out of the four main reasons that drive expectations of inflation, the exchange rate was number 1 and number 4, depending on what was actual or expected. Now, is that, I wanted to understand, now you already partly told me why that is. I mean, the pass-through seems to be very high right now from the exchange rate to domestic prices. But what role did the exchange rate have in this hybrid policy regime that you said was there post-2010? Was it a very explicit one or not? It seems that implicitly people started figuring out that to understand inflation, they need to look at the exchange rate. But was this part of the policy regime? Did that promote it implicitly or explicitly?
I think initially the approach was by 2010, the exchange rate was too appreciated by all norms. And the current account deficit was running at 8%. And, I was there at the bank and we were discussing about, we should be explicit about the level of exchange rate. And we started talking about our discontent with the appreciation. For the first time in the history, we were open about the exchange rate, and that really changed the expectations. But afterwards, I think it was as the exchange rate depreciated and there were more capital outflows after 2013, the trade-offs have increased. And the falling growth with the rising inflation has created pressures on the central bank. And the management in Turkey has become much more centralized, and that has undermined the power of institutions also. So the central bank credibility has been eroded, and the central bank was not able to respond to the exchange rate pressures as much as it wanted. And so that's a mixed structure.
Makes sense. Very good. Thank you. For everyone writing in the chat, I'm changing the order in a way that I think makes sense, but don't worry if you asked a question 10 minutes ago, I will get to it. I'm writing it down. It's just that I'm asking in the order that I think will make the discussion make more sense. So I wanted now precisely Tasneem to unmute herself and ask her question, because I think it relates to what you were just saying.
Hi, so I was wondering with the central bank reforms, what was so influential about the fact that it became independent from the government? And for example, what was happening before because the inflation rates went a lot down?
So the question is?
What was so influential about the central bank reforms, and what was it about not being independent that led to the inflation?
What was special?
Let me ask you, let me elaborate a little on what Tasneem I think means. So in 2001, the central bank independence brought inflation down very much. What was the before 30 years or 3-4 years? In what way was the dependent central bank on the government pushing up inflation? Was it because the government was pushing for a lot of seigniorage, a lot of inflating the debt, a lot of exploiting the Phillips curve? Where was the dependence pre-2001 that was driving the high inflation?
Oh, so you switched to pre-2001.
Pre-2001, yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
Since we were so much focused on the post-2001, I was looking the questions on that side, but you caught me off guard, Tashim. I think I was not there at the central bank. So that's why I focused on the post-2001 period, because from the first hand, I could observe what's going on. But, before 2000, that's what I read is that basically it was premature liberalization, financial liberalization in the 1980s, without building up the right institutions. The Turkey has opened up the capital accounts so quickly, but there was not, the institutions were lacking. There was no bank regulator. We didn't have capital markets board. We didn't have the regulators and the independent central bank and so on. And that has actually sowed the seeds of the populist policies, and the politicians started using capital flows in a populist way. Before the elections, actually, they borrowed a lot, created a lot of foreign exchange imbalances, mismatches, currency mismatches, exchange rate mismatches, and so on. So it was an unregulated procedure, and they finance the public budget deficits through borrowing from abroad in a very risky way. And that motivation actually created a significant amount of imbalances in the economy. I think that was the main driver at that time.
Super. Continuing that in 2010s, but now starting to move towards the future. I wanted to ask Aryan Agarwal to ask his question. So that was good.
Hey, Hakan, thanks for the talk. So my question was that you highlighted that one of the main problems in Turkey is the fragility to international capital flows. And this is something which is common in all emerging markets, that they're increasingly becoming reliant on international capital flows for investments. So how do emerging markets and Turkey in general create safety guards so as to save themselves if there were capital outflows in the country? How do they protect themselves from future capital outflows?
Yeah. Each country has its own style, right? But if you look across the emerging economies, they increasingly started using macroprudential policies. Some are engaging with the soft capital controls, and Turkey has opened up the capital account so quickly that it is irreversibly, actually. So it was very difficult for us to impose capital controls. Instead, in our case, for example, we use the reserve requirements intensively. We use the reserve requirements, we differentiated the reserve requirements according to the maturities of external liabilities in order to change the composition of inflows, for example, to get them less riskier. That was one approach. We have also developed a special facility at the central bank in order to absorb the capital inflows and outflows through the central bank reserves. That was another facility. We also even use the interest rate corridor, that's the conventional interest rate corridor, flexibly in order to discourage short-term capital inflows, actually. So that was a very experimental period. The thing is that the Central Bank of Turkey did not have enough tools to regulate the markets because the bank regulator is a separate entity in the Turkish case. In countries where the bank regulator and the central bank is merged, I think it is easier to implement those policies. We had to work hard in order to coordinate with the bank regulator to impose loan-to-value ratios or to impose risk weights on the consumer loans and so on. Somehow we managed to do it, actually, but it was a tough process. And some countries, they have the bank regulator inside the central bank, and it's much easier for them. For the Turkish case, we never went for the capital controls, actually, because this is another world, and we don't know, we don't know the reaction function, we don't know the model in such a case, so we refrained from doing so.
I'm going to ask now Omer. Omer, why?
Thank you, Hakan. Thank you for the great presentation and this great seminar. I'm not an economist. I study mathematics. So I do have a more general question on central banking. I asked in the chat also as well, can we reach a point where the tools of the central bank becomes ineffective to combat inflation? And which tools can then be implemented? What I mean is, for example, Argentina as an example, does it really make sense to bring up the interest rate to a level of, I don't know, 50+% and try to fight inflation? So what could be done in that case if inflation is so high that the tools of the central bank becomes ineffective?
I would add more generally, sorry, if I may ask, for Turkey, since we're talking about Turkey, where do you think the constraints on the central bank's tools bound in the last 10 years and made it hard for you to bring down inflation? And likewise with lessons for either EMs or for your future. Was it a problem of lack of tools or lack of will? You emphasized a certain lack of will, but I thought this was a great question on whether, especially as you were there, where did your tools sometimes you hit the, oh, I wish I had more tools?
Yeah. We use multiple tools to cope with the capital flow volatility. That one challenge was probably when you have massive capital outflows, and if you have high exchange rate pass-through, that's a problem because the exchange rate pass-through leads to higher inflation, and the central bank has to tighten monetary policy at a period of recession, which increases the pressures on from the society, not only from the government, but all the society is discontent with the situation. So at those instances, actually, we started talking about additional instruments. That's why we coordinated with the bank regulator, because the bank regulator has worked on the credit and the central bank focused on the exchange rate. There are two important components of the policy. When the capital flows dominate the cycles, one is credit and the second is the exchange rate. But you cannot just concentrate on the two variables with one tool. That's why you need to use either reserve requirements or central bank foreign exchange reserves in order to lift some of the weight of the main policy tool. And I think Turkey is a good example in doing that. But in the Turkish case, all this policy mix looks unsuccessful because at the end of the day, after 2013, there was no political will to bring inflation down. And that was the main problem. With respect to Argentina, actually, it's an interesting story because we had this discussion at one of the BIS meetings. The chief economist of Argentina asked me, whether we should be able to do it with interest rate policy. And I told him that we did it, and it works, actually. It works if the government allows it, because Turkey doesn't have fiscal dominance, and the transmission mechanism works in Turkey. I mean, the credit channel really works. So those are the two prerequisites in order to, prerequisites for a successful interest rate policy. And the Argentina didn't have that. They had fiscal dominance, actually, and their transmission mechanism was not strong enough. I think those are the main ingredients that you should have. And we have that in the Turkish case. That's why I'm saying that the Turkey story is not just about lack of tools. It is lack of will.
I wanted to ask a question, Hakan. To what extent, especially after you showed, and we know that Turkey had very high inflation for a very long time after the 1970s, and then again over the last 10 years, we know that when inflation often runs very high, you have adjustments in the way wages are set in society that then make it very hard to lower inflation further. For instance, widespread indexation, union contracts that then come with very high wage increases and so on. And that then makes it, precisely because you had inflation, as opposed to one burst of hyperinflation that then shatters all those solutions when it gets stabilized, because you have persistent high inflation. Are there these kind of real rigidities in your economy or baked in knowledges that make it then extremely hard to lower inflation? Or do you think, no, that these would quickly adapt? Because on the one hand, you also said Turkish economy is used to volatility, to adjust institutions fairly, and therefore not so rigid. But like I said, my prior from theory, if you want, is that, well, when you've had inflation running at 10% for a while, you're going to have a lot of wage indexation and indexation of contracts, and that makes it extremely hard to lower it. Is the indexation a big part of it, or no?
I agree. It is part of the problem. Because in recent years, as the inflation started breaching the targets constantly by a large margin, the society just started demanding higher wages. So they don't believe in the inflation targets, and everybody just wants to be compensated with past inflation. And in the Turkish case, the minimum wage is very important because almost half of the payrolls are in minimum wages or at the vicinity of the close vicinity of the minimum wages. And the minimum wages is set by the government, and it is always set in a backward-looking way, in the sense that it is almost indexed to past inflation plus some level, and that makes the Phillips curve actually that makes the inflation insensitive to the output gap and also the employment gap. So that's why the expectations and the exchange rate channel actually dominates in such a setting. But still the exchange rate channel works. So we cannot say that the monetary policy is completely incompetent. The monetary policy works. The exchange rate channel is very strong, but the demand channel is very weak, which makes the disinflation more difficult and more costly.
Super. Moving a little more towards the future as we head towards the in this talk, I was going to ask Miroslav Josic to ask us questions, since it's very much more about 2021, 22, 23.
Hi, everyone. Actually, it's a perfect moment because you just said that the inflation is insensitive to the output gap. So we recently, of course, had the change, what they call back to the orthodoxy policy in the central bank. They actually published that that inflation slowly converges to 5% by the end of the 2023, and then the output gap is kind of hovering around that 0%. Do you actually believe that this orthodoxy will last, and then that actually we will see a convergence of inflation anywhere closer to target, because that would be the historical low of inflation in Turkey?
Yeah. I mean, I think the actions speak louder than words when you don't have credibility. So the central bank just has to deliver it. It will take time to anchor inflation expectations at this time. after this performance of 15 years of breaching inflation targets on the upside, people just stopped at looking inflation targets, and you are right about your skepticism. Also, you need some luck. The problem is that after central bank has adopted this new policy, the commodity prices in the world has started increasing. So you look at the oil prices, agricultural commodities, metal prices, they are all rising up very fast. And Turkey is a net commodity importer. And that commodity prices are almost passed through the domestic prices one for one. So if in a typical inflation targeting setting, the central bank would say, okay, I will ignore it. It's a change in the relative price, okay, and it's temporary. But the central bank of Turkey doesn't have that luxury, doesn't have that flexibility because of the low credibility that has been acquired in the past. So they are now trying to convince people by raising interest rate. But the problem is that politically, it may not be infeasible because in the midst of the pandemic, when the labor market is dismal, you are tightening monetary policy. And that's a big risk for the sustainability of the whole process. I agree.
Great. And very much following up on that, Peter Jones.
Hello there. Yes, I wondered whether we could infer from the recent changes at both the central bank and also at the FinMin, whether the political authority was now prioritizing inflation targeting. I noted in one of your slides, you question whether inflation targeting was ever a priority. Could Agbel be the Turkish Volcker, and could this be finally the opportunity where inflation is brought under control? Thank you.
I think the new governor made a good start. He tightened monetary policy. He simplified the policy framework and threw out the complex instruments. And he focused this medium-term price stability, bringing inflation down to 5% in the medium term. And he tightened monetary policy in a consequent steps. I think those are the right directions. Those are the steps in the right direction. But as I mentioned, it depends on whether the preferences or the objective functions of the top authorities have changed or not. So we cannot say that the central bank is fully insulated from political influence. It would not be realistic actually to assume that, right? So to my intuition, I mean, according to my personal experience, I can say that the government's objective function has some more weight towards disinflation now, because there is a discontent from the society. It's very important because they care about the votes, and now the society complains about the inflation a lot. And that also explains the Volcker period, because during the 1970s, I mean, the politicians in the US, they look at the polls and they see that the inflation is the #1 discontent in the US, right? And Volcker was backed by this, by the support by the politicians. Whether that's the same case in the Turkey or not, it remains to be seen. But I think after inflation comes down to single digits, the politicians will again switch back to the pro-growth policies. So the central bank will probably manage to bring inflation down to single digits. But I think when the inflation comes down to single digits, again, the political will try to boost growth, because the unemployment rate is high, and then the #1 problem is still unemployment in Turkey. So in that sense, I have a mixed answer to your question. I don't think that the objective function has completely shifted right now, but at least for a temporary period, I think there is more weight on inflation on the objective function. Thank
you. Hilal Taskan with a very short question.
Thank you, professors. I would like to learn what if central bank changes the inflation targeting framework from targeting the change to targeting the price level by itself, because if I'm not wrong, you told us that average inflation between 2010 and 20 is 10%, which seems a little bit positive number to the society. Maybe this may manage people's expectations. Does it contribute?
I see. I think average inflation targeting is a good idea when you have zero lower bound, right? We don't have that problem in Turkey, right? So I think bygones will be bygones in the Turkish case.
Sana, I wanted to ask you could we talk a little bit about the pandemic and generally how does that change the outlook for the central bank? I mean, do you think that it will make it easier or harder? We were talking a little bit about luck or bad luck or good luck, but also how would you say that the strategy of the central bank and the path of inflation will depend on how quickly we recover from COVID-19, either internationally or domestically in Turkey?
I think it is creating challenges now because the central bank started tightening monetary policy, but the economy is recovering from pandemics. And also globally, the 10 US interest rates are rising. So that's creating a lot of volatility in capital flows. And second, all that liquidity and the recovery of China is driving up the commodity prices, which is also another factor driving up inflation. So in such an environment, actually, the horizon that the central bank has to keep inflation tight, the monetary policy tight, that horizon is extending. So the central bank has to keep a tight monetary policy for an extended period, actually. And that is a risk from a political perspective, because I don't think that the politicians will be patient enough to see the inflation coming back to targets. So at some point, I think that will create challenges for the central bank.
Fantastic. We only have 3 more minutes, so I wanted to ask you the final question. So a little bit of a catch-all, allowing you to both summarize, but from a particular perspective. This is the society at the LSE that looks just generally at developing economies. From what you taught us over the last 55 minutes, both in terms of the experience of the last 10, 20 years, as well as the challenges right now and looking forward to Turkey, what do you think are the lessons that you would take if you're advising a country that's not Turkey, but has similar conditions in emerging markets? What do you think are the key principles that you say that, given how I teach these students how to think about inflation, always with a big advanced economy bias, but also sometimes talking about emerging markets. But what do you think, what would you tell me, Ricardo, this is how you have to change your class when you teach these students in terms of important things that I've learned in my experience in Turkey that can be Turkish lessons for the world, let's put it that way?
I think the first lesson is consistency is very important in policies. I mean, do what you say and see the effects and explain to people actually transparently that why it worked, why it didn't work. So being honest is important for managing expectations, because in the Turkish case, we played with different methodologies, different approaches. And sometimes, actually, in the Turkish case, because of the political pressures, the governments started using indirect policies, actually, to tighten monetary policy. And but that doesn't, I mean, those policies actually don't last forever, because as long as the market understands what you are doing, you are much worse off because the credibility is gone. And once the credibility is gone, it takes a long time to get it back. So the credibility is your precious asset. So that's very, very important. I think the second lesson is that don't count on the stability of inflation expectations. That's also a lesson for the advanced economies, actually. So, I mean, don't just rely on the fact that you have anchored inflation expectations, because the inflation expectations can be disanchored very quickly once you have persistent deviation of inflation from the targets. So be careful about letting inflation exceed the target for an extended period. So those are the lessons I can.
Fantastic. We're just on time. Thank you so much. I at least learned quite a lot, and I will definitely, I mean, those two lessons were already somewhat in my class, Hakan, but I'm going to emphasize them more, as especially we're going to be talking about credibility in my class, of which some of the students are there in 10 days when we talk about time consistency. And I'll probably borrow some of your slides or some of the things I saw to use this time. Thank you so much. This was terrific. I'm just going to pass the word at the end to Mitul for him to conclude in the behalf of the society. But from my perspective, or from my behalf, a big thank you to everyone also for the great questions. And back to you, Mitul.
Yeah, sure. I was actually going to pass on to someone else, but okay, sure. So this is Developing Markets. Thank you all for coming. We've got one more event on the 23rd of March, so be sure to turn up to that. Thank you very, very much to our speaker, Hakan Kara. Thank you so much to Ricardo Reis for moderating this. And thanks to everyone in the audience for showing up. That's all from us. So take care and goodbye. Have a lovely rest of your evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.